Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 17th Annual Teaching Practices Colloquium. Our theme this year is Teaching and Learning Without Walls. We'd like to give a very big thank you to our CELT, which is our Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, whose sponsorship has allowed us to have this event this year for free. And we also ask for everyone's patience during the day in case of any tech problems. This is our first time going virtual, and we do have some backup tech people, but please let us know if you're having any issues. I would like to turn it over to Christine, my colleague and co-chair.
Thanks, Terry. And we're so pleased that you're here today. And before we get started, we'd like to begin in a good way. And so we acknowledge and give honor to the Secwepemc people who've lived on this land for thousands of years, upon which the traditional and unceded land that TRU is located on. And so as we go throughout the day, we need to know that teaching and learning has been happening here on the unceded territory within Secwepemc for thousands of years. And we're so pleased to be guests on this land today. And if you're attending TPC from a different area, we hope you'll give acknowledgement to the land that you're on today. So our first video of welcome that we're going to show you today is from Elder Doe, and she's going to open us up with a blessing on the day.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another day of learning, sharing outside the box creative ideas. One of the best teaching tools I've learned as a much older student, returning back and incorporating learning techniques was to use healing Sharon circles. Just an idea to consider. I wish you all the best in the exchange of ideas, the creativity, and the opportunity to continue to teach your young minds to move forward and to also keep encouraging them, supporting them with their own ideas and their own creativity. One of my best teachers as a young student was one who allowed me to expand my own horizon by making mistakes. As a so-called elder, that's how I learn on a day-to-day basis. I wish you nothing but success in this venture that you're in, and really encourage to reach out to community resources for their potential teaching tools and skill sets that you may be able to use. I thank you for your time, and thank you for inviting me to open the blessing. Have a great day. Thank you, Cookschum.
All right, and now I'd like to welcome a short video clip from our president of TRU, Brett Fairbairn.
Hello to each and every one of you. My name is Brett Fairbairn, and I'm president at Thompson Rivers University. Every year I look forward to the Teaching Practices Colloquium because of the energy, the creativity, and the commitment that are so evident among all the participants. I can visualize the full rooms I met with in past years, and I'm imagining all of you out there this year as I join you from my dining room, like most of us working remotely these days. I know that you will already have acknowledged the territory, and you will have had an elder ground your meeting to start in a good way. I want to reiterate that our commitments as a university begin with our commitments to land, to place, and to the peoples who have stewarded and continued to steward these lands. We are not the first community of teachers and learners in this place. We honor the Secwepemc, the ancestral peoples who have lived here since time immemorial. We honor our first host, to Kamloops to Secwepemc, on whose unceded land our Kamloops campus is located. And we respect our second host, Taochalch, on whose unceded land our Williams Lake campus is located. And in addition, we recognize and respect neighboring Indigenous nations whom we serve, the St'át'imc, the Nlaka'pamux, the Newhak, the Tsilhqot'in, and the Dakelh. Wherever you are, please acknowledge the territory that you are on today. Our Indigenous hosts received many settlers who moved into their lands over the last 200 years, good ones and bad ones, and they could tell the difference by how much the newcomers respected Indigenous culture and rights. Those of us who come to these lands from outside aim to be good guests and inhabitants here. That's an institutional commitment by TRU. Sadly, I'm unable to be with you this morning because of chairing another meeting, but I don't wish to miss this opportunity to thank you. Thank you for attending today and for your belief in the power of mindful and thoughtful teaching. Thank you for your exceptional efforts to support our students over the last year and counting of wholesale disruption. In some ways, the world has been turned on its head, but one thing that has not changed is that teaching is very important. Teaching and learning change lives. They change the world, and that's never been more important than it is right now. While some have secure families, jobs, and prospects during the pandemic, many others do not. Communities, regions, and industries have been devastated. Recovery in jobs and economic activity is important. In our region, tourism and culture-related industries, among others, have been hard hit. Our students and our graduates will play a role in the recovery. And there's growing evidence that a disproportionate share of the burden is falling on the same groups that have been undervalued or marginalized in the past: women, Indigenous communities, Black communities, minority and ethnic communities of all types. There's a risk of increase in old forms of discrimination and inequality. There's a risk to intercultural understanding, to internationalization, to a peaceful world. And there's a risk that society could be distracted from the commitment to fighting and managing climate change, which we were inching towards before the pandemic. Such inequities demand a response from all of us at TRU. This past year, in 2020, we adopted a new statement of our vision, values, and goals. That statement was more than 12 months in the making, and it represented thousands of contributions online and in person. We set out a vision that, community-minded with a global conscience, we boldly redefine the university as a place of belonging, Quetzalcoatl. We're all related and interconnected with nature, each other, and all things. We aim to be a place where all people are empowered to transform themselves, their communities, and the world. That vision really emphasizes our connections with nature and between people, inspired by our roots here in this place. And we set out our values of inclusion and diversity, of community-mindedness, of curiosity and sustainability. We set out 10-year strategic change goals to eliminate achievement gaps, to honor truth, reconciliation, and rights, to lead in community research and scholarship, and to be the ones who design lifelong learning. You can find that vision statement online at tru.ca/envision. I encourage you to embrace those values and visionary goals, including in your teaching. In times like these, we are reminded that our university has a mission, regardless of any virus. Students and communities need us. We're here for them no matter what. With your efforts, support, and leadership, we will make sure that current generations do not get left behind. We're here to keep educating students, to keep developing communities, and to lead the recovery that is coming. And that begins with teaching. So you have an exciting and full program ahead of you, I know. Once again, welcome. Thank you for being part of our community. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your commitment to teaching.
Thank you very much. And we want to give a special thank you to our next speaker here. And we would like to give a big thank you to CELT, the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, because without their support, we would not have been able to run our event and make it free for all of the participants this year. And so next I would like to introduce Catherine Dischke. She's the director of CELT, and she has sent us a video to welcome us.
Catherine Dischke Hansel in Quest. Hi everyone, my name is Catherine Dischke Hansel and I'm the director of the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. Most of you watching probably already knew that. The cat in the basket behind me is Piper, and she may be providing her own little show in the back as I'm making this recording. So though this is a recording, I'd like to offer my thanks to those who have spoken before me and offer their wisdom to our community. As I'm following welcomes from people who have very deep roots and important family connections to the traditional stewards of this land, I'd like to offer my own personal acknowledgement as a guest in this territory. So I acknowledge with deep respect the Secwepemc peoples on whose territory I currently live, work, and enjoy with my family. The land of Secwepemc is and has always been a place of learning, teaching, and community. I'm an uninvited settler on this land, and so I wish to offer my thanks and gratitude to the peoples who live on and who have cared for this land since time immemorial. I wish to also acknowledge that I was born and spent most of my life living on the lands shared by the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Mississauga peoples on the Grand River between the Great Lakes. That's also a place that I call home. So as we move towards the keynote speakers, I'd like to first offer my thanks to the organizing committee for the huge amount of work they've put into this year's event. It wasn't that long ago that we were dealing with the shift to Tuesday because of Family Day and really thought that was going to be the big hurdle that we'd be overcoming. I certainly don't think that any of us at last year's TPC were quite prepared for the year-long professional and personal growth journey that we were about to embark on. So, to the TPC committee, thank you for taking on the work of bringing the TPC to life online. To Sherry and Christine, thank you so much for taking on the effort of co-chairing again this year. And so to the team, Florianne, Chris, Kim, Stephen, Candace, Aaron, Carolyn Ives, Carol Sparks, Matthew, Carolyn Hosler, and Christine Peterson, I'm sure you are all thrilled that the work you've put in over the past months is finally on display. Thank you for persisting through what I'm sure were many obstacles and many competing interests. And to the many presenters at this year's TPC, this program is incredible because of you. There's certainly a strong theme of resilience and celebration for all the ways that we've learned to adapt to the circumstances of the new COVID-19 reality. Indeed, with the theme of going beyond, every session becomes a celebration of learning and the ways that faculty have gone above and beyond for their students and for their colleagues. Many of us have struggled with our well-being and keeping our bearings this past year. The uncertainty of COVID-19's trajectory, increasingly stringent public health plans, and the stress of adapting to the constantly changing environment have often felt dangerous, somewhat like stumbling around in the dark. And so, to all of you, I commend you for your strength over the past year and on the strength you will continue to draw on in the months to come. I feel so grateful to those of you who trusted CELT and shared your experiences, both good and bad, with us this year, and then gave us the opportunity to support you. I'm very much looking forward to learning from many of you today and popping back in throughout the term to watch the recorded sessions. And so with that, I've kept it under 5 minutes. Thank you, Cooksham, for making time for the Teaching Practices Colloquium and continuing to make it a success as it turns 18. Thanks, and enjoy the show.
All right. Thank you, Catherine, for that lovely welcome. And we have one last thing to do before Sherry introduces our lovely keynotes, and that is to give out one of our draw baskets. Now, normally we would have a bucket and all your names, and I would pick one, but we have to change with the times, don't we? And so this year I used a random number generator, and I have a participant list in my Excel spreadsheet. And so the random number generator chose number 66, and that is Wendy Krause. And so Wendy, if you're listening, yahoo! And if you're not, that's okay. I will email you and make arrangements for you to pick up your door prize. Now, your door prize, thank you, John, is a lovely, lovely gift basket from Esther's Market, who has always been super supportive of our TPC scheming. Thanks a lot. And I'll pass things over to Sherry.
Okay, so it is my pleasure to give a very warm welcome to our two keynotes today, Dave Cormier and Bonnie Stewart. They are both from the University of Windsor in Ontario. Dr. Bonnie Stewart is an assistant professor of online pedagogy and learning workplace. She is also a social media researcher. Dave is a digital learning specialist and a learning community advocate, and he has worked hard to try to make education better for everyone. He's currently working as an online learning specialist with a focus in digital learning strategies. Their keynote address today is titled Beyond Crisis, Envisioning Online Education for 2021 Beyond. And it is a three-part keynote address. And once each of them will speak individually and then together, and then they will have open up discussion to a shared panel. So I will hand it over to Bonnie and Dave. Thank you.
Good morning, folks. I'm the Bonnie, I guess, in the Bonnie and Dave show this morning, and we are honored and delighted to be with you. Before I start, Dave, do you want to?
Sure. I wasn't expecting that, but hi, everybody. Dave Cormier, and I am very happy to be here. That was a great introduction, actually. I really love the way that this flows. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Please do feel free to drop questions in the YouTube chat. We will pick them up by the end of the talk. But there's about a 40-second delay between us talking and the chats coming back to us. So put them in there when you have them, and we'll pick them up as we go.
And that'll be great. We are joining you from the traditional territory of the three fires of the Confederacy, the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. And we are both actually originally from out east, from the unceded territory of Mi'kmaq. And it is snowing here this morning, and kind of a pleasure to join all of you in your learning. I'm going to share my screen. I noticed that your director of CELT said year-long professional growth journey, and certainly that is very much what we've been on as well here. Just let me get the tab open, and so we wanted to talk a little bit about that, really. And our title, I'll take sort of the first part, and then Dave will pick up. We live in the same house. We are life partners, as well as sometimes working intersectingly. But we wanted to talk about this whole past 11 months has kind of been a series of just crisis after crisis. And what comes after this? And how do we build on these lessons and work together? And in order to kind of envision that, I wanted to begin by just saying that my own work has been in digital education really for about 2 decades now, with a basis in adult ed. So I started from a participatory learning teaching kind of perspective, and I work on participatory learning in digital spaces. And that has been something that has been challenging this year, because these tools, while they can allow for participatory learning, even with the delay that we're experiencing today, some of that back and forth shifts and changes. And I like to think about digital work as part of a larger context of culture and time. And we are definitely in the most interesting culture, time, space context that I've worked in digital education yet over this past year. I did want to turn this back to you, and I won't be able to see what you do, but I just want you to formulate in your own mind. Imagine that you could either write on this screen or think of a word or two that would encapsulate for you 2020's impact on your work. And that word might be exhausting. That word might be whatever fits for you, but just frame that in your mind. Okay. Because when I stopped to think about what has been 2020's impact on my own work, I've spent 20 years in digital education, but we were always working with folks who maybe chose to work in the digital for the most part. And suddenly this year, everyone has kind of been forced on board. And that has been both an incredible opportunity and also a real shock to the system, both for, I think, what it means to be in digital and for people's sense of what happens in their teaching and engagement. I had wanted to ask, because I'm not entirely sure what everyone in the room does, but I know that all of you are engaged in some way with the mission of the university. For me, when I think about 2020, and particularly that sort of nested level of institutional and cultural and temporal moments, I see higher ed at the center of this series of 3 crises. And we have the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously. We have the not new by any stretch, but certainly with the killing of George Floyd and the rise of Black Lives Matter, to a level that had not been perhaps heard in the same ways before, an awareness of racial inequities and a perhaps institutional move towards beginning to try to address some of the racial inequities that have structured often the work that we do. And then more broadly, also a crisis that may not be as visible to all of us, which is the automation of our society and the ways in which our reliance on digital tools this year has brought forward some real issues around the digital tools that we use. We are in a space and time of a great many reckonings. And that felt like 2020 for me, at least. And then we moved into 2021, and I was great for about 5 days, and then we had a coup south of the border, very close to us here, and we also now are seeing, cats. I'm not a cat, lawyer cat, 21. I don't feel as if we are out of any of the crises of 2020, but rather that they were a moment that hopefully brought us some clarity about things that we need to deal with. So in this conversation today, I'm not talking about how do we leave these pieces behind, but really rather how do we begin to consider what these mean for particularly online education going forward, if we want to make it human, if we want to make it equitable, and if we want to make it something that as society deals perhaps with a changing global health and climate disruption, how do we make online education something that we want to be involved in? How do we respond, right? And what does it mean to go forward together? This is just a book that someone had recommended to me a few months ago. And this little clip from the Google blurb on it it pointed out that part of what's happening in this moment is that there are new divisions as well as opportunities for connection being unleashed on the already frayed collective culture on which that participatory learning concept that most of my work has been based in is grounded in. And that point around divisions and opportunities is key to the work that I want to think about. It's really important that we recognize that those crises that I mentioned are very much not one size fits all, right? This tweet first came out literally a month into the pandemic, pointing out, this whole thing will dramatically exacerbate existing structures of privilege. I've had the privilege of spending most of the pandemic in this room, which used to be my closet and is now my office, because most of my clothes can live in the basement because I don't necessarily need to leave my house on a daily basis and dress up and all of those things. This crisis is not impacting me in the same way that it does someone who is working on the front lines in medicine or on the front lines in a grocery store. Some crises are short-term, but they're pretty huge. This is literally a picture, a screenshot that with permission I took of a student's background behind them in their apartment while they presented to their class last fall. I'm not a monster. I teach I teach adults and Bachelor of Education students, and they had a group assignment and they were teaching for the first time, and this one student is a real leader in our class. And I knew that he had taken kind of charge of his group and he was the person sharing the slides. But while he was sharing, there was this terrible noise in the background and I thought someone else had their mic on. So eventually I just popped in the chat, excuse me, does somebody have their mic on? There's a real sound issue. And my student who was presenting, who was simply sharing slides but didn't have their screen on, stopped and said, I'm really sorry. He turned the camera on. He said, this is what's behind me. And I went, oh my goodness, like you're in a demolition zone. What's going on? He lives in a studio apartment and his upstairs neighbor had apparently had a huge leak a couple of days before. And that morning at 8 a.m., his landlord had decided to send in the destruction crew to take down his entire kitchen. Our class was at 10. And he just decided, I better roll with it. I had no idea this was going on, right? But that was what was happening. And so sometimes people's apartments are literally being torn apart while they're sitting in them in class. Some crises are far more systemic than that, right? This is the case just across the border here. 15-year-old Black student literally was sent to jail last summer for failing to hand in her homework. Right? I can assure you, Dave and I have 2 kids. They did not necessarily hand in everything that they were given during last spring's asynchronous learning pieces. No one was sending them to jail. There is a real institutional racism has a huge impact on education, and people experience different outcomes. And that systemic crisis is something that has only become more visible in this time. And some of these crises are things that are less visible, right? They don't get reported about so much in the New York Times, but they are definitely impacting the work that all of us do. Data surveillance, technological solutionism. Oh, education is a problem. Here, let's solve it this way. This is the director of OECD's education section saying, yeah, all the red tape is gone. People are looking for solutions. Real change takes place in deep crisis. That can be true, but if the change that takes place is something that simply treats education as a push-button problem with an easy solution, the education that we come out with at the end may not necessarily be something that meets the pedagogical, ethical, equitable goals that we have. If the drivers of education become for-profit systems, we're working in a very different field than we started out. And we're seeing that in online proctoring. I'm sure this is a conversation that you folks are having at TRU. This story is quite amazing. Online proctoring are the systems by which you can hold large-scale tests and be assured that students are not cheating, so that they can, these tools are embedded in students' devices and allow the tool to see the room of the student as they take the test. One of TRU's folks, Brenna Clark-Gray, hosted a great Against Surveillance panel back on the 1st of December, I believe, kind of pushing back against online proctoring, and particularly the pretty egregious behaviors of some of the tools involved. But this young woman, she was a lawyer. She was pregnant, expecting to take her bar exam in July. It was postponed due to the pandemic. She was reassigned a date in October. She was sitting there with her proctoring tool on, and literally her water broke and she went into labor, and reported as a happy story in all of the news media. Look, isn't it great? She finished her exam and then she went off and had a baby. And the next morning she was back on doing part 2. And I looked at that and I thought, really, this isn't like an aspirational thing that we want for students. Increasingly, proctoring is becoming a built-in package in many textbook companies that many of our institutions are already tied to through a variety of deals. So McGraw-Hill, which is a huge textbook company in the Canadian education space, now has Proctorio bundled in. If you're using McGraw-Hill textbook, Proctorio is part of the exam offerings that come with what you're doing. The doors there are left open to facial recognition. Some of you may know Colin Madland out in BC. He is an instructional developer, and he was working with a faculty colleague back in September, trying to figure out why that colleague couldn't get his Zoom to put a background behind him. It kept disappearing his face. So Colin went on a call with the faculty colleague and realized, this is a Black man, and facial recognition technology often completely fails on the faces of people of color, even sometimes on the faces of white women. It does really, really well with people who look like Colin. But these tools do not work equitably. And yet we have turned over a great deal of our infrastructure of basically what the classroom means, right? We've turned over the four walls of the classroom to these tools in this past year. And that in itself can be a little bit of a crisis, potentially. None of this is actually new, right? I love this cross stitch. Corona exposed a broken system. The nested crisis that I brought up earlier, those three crises, make the fault lines of this field simply visible to us. I spent many years as an adjunct and a sessional instructor in Canada, and I've taught online for 20 years and almost 17 of them as an adjunct. It was really fascinating to sit in my faculty meetings this year as someone with the privilege of a tenure track position and hear all my colleagues go, "This is more work." And I'm like, yes, thank you for noticing. And suddenly, you know, there was a movement in some of our faculty discussions around, well, perhaps we should all get a course release because of the extra work of teaching online. And I kind of raised my hand and I said, well, how is a course release going to benefit any of the sessionals who have taught online this year? It's not. So there we are. Many of these crises have their foundation in one key thing, and that is what Dave and I both work with, a concept that we call information abundance or knowledge abundance. This is not by any stretch our idea, but certainly a foundation in both of our work. And what it really means, I like the picture of the hose because I think of knowledge abundance as essentially a fire hose, right? You're sitting here online, you may have other tabs open, you may have Netflix playing in the background, you probably have a phone somewhere nearby or in your pocket. Just at your fingertips, you have access to more information than literally would have been in the whole library of the university that I started at back in the late 80s, right? Absolutely. At the same time, it isn't just a digital thing, this idea of knowledge abundance. This quote is from 1975. It is no longer possible to store within the human brain all the information that a human needs, and it's no longer necessary to store within the human brain all the information we need. Now, Berlow's recommendation in 1975 was education needs to be geared toward the handling of data rather than the accumulation of data. Excellent. Not sure that we have fully gotten there, but that concept of knowledge abundance is core to thinking about how do we handle that constant fire hose that's coming at us? How do we take out maybe the droplets that we need and make meaning and do sense making within that fire hose? And some of the divisions, some of the separations and kind of breaking up of that sense of common community and connection come from that crisis, really, of knowledge abundance. Now, my experience of working in digital and online education in a time of knowledge abundance is we don't actually need to choose between the classroom, which means certain things to us, and the internet. That there is room for something really meaningful to happen even in an internet-spaced classroom. And I would imagine that many of you may have either been doing this for a long time or certainly have done some of this year. But I just want you to think about what, for you, did the internet open up for your classroom, and potentially what maybe did it take away if you were teaching and if you were supporting folks? In what way did that kind of conversation shape your year in 2020? I think it's important how we think about the internet. the infrastructure of the internet is not just cat videos, but also not just the disaster of the last few years, right? The monitoring, the real-time collapse of late-stage capitalism. How many of you remember the idea of Web 2.0? Right? That idea that what you contribute and put out on the web is something that other people will pick up and experience and learn from. That core was really the basis of the type of education that I began to work in when I started in digital education. That sense that I want to use the internet to connect my students to contributing to knowledge abundance, contributing to the web, and then also taking in what's out there. But often when we are teaching in classrooms, we make them sites of false scarcity. We put those four walls as pieces meant to keep the web and all that messiness out. And so the participatory, I love Betty White, gets pushed out of the picture. There it goes. We don't want it anymore because it's part of what the messiness of knowledge abundance. But if we're going to work in online spaces, it's really important, I think, particularly building on this year, that we move away from that traditional e-learning, isolated, just delivering knowledge piece and move to forms of, and again, I come from a faculty of education. We are still deeply, deeply attached to Bloom's taxonomy. But that idea of that working with application and analysis and evaluation and creation, those types of thinking, those types of pedagogy are things that the internet does really, really well. And they're things that allow for participatory engagement with students that just knowledge and understanding type activities don't. And so making the most of the internet as platform means exposing students, often in small scaffolded ways, to their capacity to contribute to the society that we're in and to knowledge abundance. I love this picture because I think it encapsulates the way that a lot of us, myself included, felt when we had whole programs move to online this year, right? Many of my students don't know how to actually contribute to knowledge abundance, which seems funny because we've been hearing the word digital natives, which you will otherwise never hear out of my mouth, a concept that has been debunked even by the person who invented it. But we've been hearing about that for 20 years. We see our students or our kids, they're on their phones all the time, but that does not mean that they know how to use the internet for participatory learning or to give and take within a world of knowledge abundance. And to an extent, I think the core element of moving forward from here will be trying to actively think about connection as part of communicating online. Getting past that sort of plastic wall and the masks that maybe have created barriers. I'm a big fan of Garrison, Anderson, and Archer's 2001 model of presence. The community of inquiry, whole community has been designed on that. And the idea of this, very basically, in early online education research, it was important to show that the educational experience isn't just what we think we're teaching, right? That cognitive presence, that online learning is more than just a correspondence course that's put onto a computer. That cognitive presence is just the content. But the teaching presence is the thing that you potentially as an instructor or the instructor brings to an online experience. The places in which, how do you smile at your class when you're online and potentially maybe you don't have a camera on? How do you recognize maybe smiles or forms of extension and engagement that are coming back at you from your students because they probably don't have their cameras on. That has become less and less the norm over this past year. How do you build spaces in learning where they can have the experience of feeling like they're part of a learning community when maybe the chat is one of the few spaces where they will engage? How do you build opportunities for them to have that sense of being part of an event, a thing, a learning experience together? The work that Garrison, Anderson, and Archer did 20 years ago indicated that really, as long as two of those are strong, students tend to report a pretty positive educational experience. But in the 2020 model, certainly a lot of folks were just kind of surviving with getting through and getting their cognitive presence out there, and maybe some element of teaching presence. And I think it's really important as we look ahead beyond just the current moment to think about, if we're going to be doing online education as perhaps a much bigger thing than we have to date. And certainly in Ontario and K-12, it looks like that is the intent of our particular government. I'm hoping that we can focus on elements of social presence as part of this. Sometimes it's really easy to just build in things like discussion board posts and hope that those stand in for social presence. Look, I asked the students to post something and respond to each other, but I don't know how many of you have tried that and seen that your posts end up like this. I definitely have set these discussion boards up and made this mistake. And I asked students to reiterate something that they've read, and then they reiterate it. And the other students are like, yes, I love bread too, because what can they say about it? Because I haven't asked them a question that actually gives them any place to engage. I'm asking for mastery learning questions. And so one of the things that I've had to learn to do to build social presence with my students is pull back from asking them to show what they've mastered in those kind of spaces, and instead ask questions that allow them to share something where they actually relate to what I want them to talk about, right? To give some kind of personal engagement, some kind of interpretive space for them. And then I've had to teach them. And in my case, I teach Bachelor of Education students, so they're going to be teachers. They need to learn to give formative feedback. I use a model that I found on the internet about 8 years ago to encourage them to structure their comments to each other so that they are actually, instead of saying, you said you love bread, that's good, they are giving 4 sentences, one that's like, I relate to this, one that's a question, one that's a suggestion, and one that maybe even encourages their peer partner to take the ideas further. This is not a perfect model, but it has served me very, very well in the last number of years, not just this year, but I've been using it for 4 or 5 years. And it gives students a structure to actually offer a little bit of constructive criticism to each other. It gives permission for that, while also encouraging them to dig in a little bit to the things that people are trying to say. It doesn't mean that discussion board engagement is the be all and end all of social presence, but it allows them to build a little bit of sense of who each other are. And the relate piece is really important. I've had students who at the beginning of a course maybe share a kind of a view from where they're sitting. And students, other peers will give Rise feedback on that. And they'll be like, hey, I have the same couch. Or, oh, you said your dog's name is Fluffy. My cat's name is Fluffy. It's that little bit of human social grooming that we do if we sit down in a classroom next to each other. We don't sit down with somebody and say, hello, I am considering studying this subject for this reason. We say, hey, those are nice shoes. And this gives them a space and a way to be able to say, hey, those are nice ideas, or that is something that I relate to. So that's been one piece, very basic piece of social presence building that I think is important for us to consider as we go forward. I still see a need for us to work towards genuine human networked connection, even in online spaces. And this visual from years ago now is something that is really important for us, I think, to consider when we're thinking about knowledge abundance, because in the left-hand image, the students who are isolated dots are not contributing back to knowledge abundance to each other, whereas on the right, as a broad loose model, they have some of that opportunity at least. I think the three keys, and I'm just kind of setting a stage here for Dave to take over. Zoom's here to stay, whatever platform we're using, right? But we need to learn to use the internet intentionally. And maybe going forward, we specifically choose spaces when we can be together in person, while also considering where are the times when actually the ways in which the internet allows for that kind of many-to-many networked communication works better than a classroom, because students are more likely to share online sometimes about certain things than they will face-to-face, right? We need to consider those norms of passive online engagement and work beyond them, getting students thinking about knowledge abundance. And this is big, and I think this is one that Dave is going to take on. Students will continue to have the teacher's copy. So we need to learn how to assess authentically and not just look for mastery learning ideas. Now, initially we had designed this so that there would be a break right now. I don't think there is a break right now, but I would love it if you could share in the chat as Dave switches over. What do you think students are looking for from their learning experiences right now? And that would let Dave kind of get a sense of where you're all at. And thank you. And I will hand it over to him and stop sharing.
Thanks, Bonnie. Good job. Okay, so I've been playing around in the chat room. I appreciate the conversation going on in there, folks. Consider the time for one. So I'm sensitive to Ted's commentary in the chat room about the language that we're using around working online, whether it's online learning or e-learning or the sort of disaster learning that we were doing last March, and sort of the ways that things have progressed since. Certainly the faculty that I was talking to in March and the work that they were doing in March was super, super different than what they were doing in September. And again, much different than what they were doing in January of this year. So, I mean, there's been a real progression, I think, in terms of people's thinking about this, which has been really great. I would also suggest that a lot of what was traditionally seen as e-learning or online learning, depending on where you were standing, a lot of it was not necessarily all that great either. Some of it was good. Okay, so I want to sort of zero in a little bit on some of the comments that Bonnie was making and go into some really specifics about some ideas that people can take forward in terms of thinking about what their future courses could look like, thinking about how they can adapt their courses. We've done a bunch of shout outs to people at TRU. I'm going to shout out to Brian Lamb here, just because he was so formative in my own work sort of early on, introducing me to the open community. Thanks, Brian. So what I want to do is talk about the students that we actually currently have. I really think that the last 5 years has created this gigantic shift in the positionality of our students. I think that the ways in which the information abundance that Bonnie was talking about has impacted them, and the ways that faculty have responded to them, have had a fundamental impact on really what universities and colleges and even K-12 schools really look like. So what I'd like to do is zero in on some of those pieces and see if we can't come up with some just my suggestions in terms of what I think can be helpful. And I'd love to hear back from you guys about the stuff that you're doing and sort of your ideas on this as well. So first, just a quick piece about me. I've been doing online learning for about 20 years now. Currently working in the Office of Open Learning at the University of Windsor, but I've worked in a lot of different places, both administratively and also done some research on education-y stuff, and sort of been trying to pick away at this whole internet thing and what it actually means, not just to what you do day to day in a classroom, but what we should be doing as teachers and educators and learners. So really, at the end of the day, I just think of myself as an online learner, whether it's for woodworking or it's for the sort of educational stuff that I do. I tend to turn to the internet more and more all the time now. So when we're talking about design, one of the things we've got to think about is just the context that we're in. And there's two pieces of this that I really want to address. The first is the information context. And Bonnie, like I said, brushed on this earlier. I want to dig just a little bit deeper into that and then really settle in on the student context. Because at the end of the day here, we're in the process. I mean, it's a school, right? We're in the process of teaching students. And for all the research we may do in each of our given fields, which is definitely important, you know, research service, that teaching component has got to be about those students, right? So I want to match up those two pieces and talk about some things that we can do going forward, some of the lessons maybe that we've pulled out of the COVID. So first thing, it's changed. Like this is what a book used to look like. So this, an average, I think was the Bible, it was the skins of 200 sheep that it took to create one book. And then a poor monk sitting by a window copying out a text. And you end up in a school system where obviously you are not going to have people pawing those books. You're obviously not going to have people combing, like general students just grabbing onto this stuff, right? And with the materials being what they are, with the education system being what they are, the rarity of these books, people are traveling, 100 miles to get to a school, University of Paris, University of Bologna, the formation of our university system is super rare. We end up with a catechetical model. I call out, you respond back with what I said so that you can somehow get Aristotle's physics into your head. Like it totally makes sense. I understand why we taught that way, because the information was super, super scarce, right? It was expensive to make, and those poor sheep, right? And those poor sort of monks sitting there trying to copy this stuff over, making mistakes, trying to copy from bad copies, is a difficult information landscape. That's all I'm saying, right? Our universities were formed in the midst of information scarcity to its extreme. And now that's changed. We've moved from scarcity to abundance, and there's nothing we can do about it, right? There's no going back. There's no refinding that cone of artificial scarcity where we've kept students out and away from this information. There's no way for us to say, I have this thing in my head and I'm going to keep it from you until I'm ready to give it to you. Or I'm going to ask you a question and withhold the answer until you give it to me, right? Like we just can't have that kind of interaction anymore because the information is abundant. It's everywhere, right? Our whole education system is premised on the idea of me, the teacher, being in charge of everything. I get to control it. I get to have it, and then you get to give it, you get to get it whenever I feel like giving it to you. Maybe I will pace the information I give to you. I'm not going to release this piece of information that I have to you right now. I will give it to you later, right? That is the entire education system that basically everybody in this room went through, right? The teacher has complete control over the information space, right? And there's great power in that, right? There's a great amount of comfort in that. I know a lot of teachers feel really comfortable if they're this person who knows everything. They even see themselves as that being their responsibility as a teacher. I would posit to you that that's going to be hard going forward because you simply do not have that monopoly anymore. Illich tells us that once the thing is no longer scarce, you can no longer control it. And that's what it comes down to, right? Once you can no longer control that information, your classroom changes. Your students can reach out and grab that information at any point in time. Right? They have this incredible ability, this incredible access to all this information in any of our fields. They can go out and get it, and they can, flick of a phone, they reach out through a Google search, and they can get the information they want, and we call it cheating. So we set up a situation where we're still like those monks, doing the chanting and the repeating, expecting them, the student, to repeat back what we've told them, so they can memorize the thing and keep it in their head. A model that was super effective 800 or 900 years ago, right? But in a model where any of those students can now reach out and find that information, right? No longer applies. I mean, COVID didn't do this to us. What COVID has done is forced us all to look at it, right? So let's take a really simple example. So I'm going to ask in the chat room, and you guys can can let me know, and while I'm chatting, I'll pick it up. So give me a yes or no. How many people are familiar with Chegg? So just give me a yes or no in the chat room. And so those of you who don't know, Chegg is an assignment help system that allows students to go in. They have to pay for an account, and they can go in and trade answers with other students. They can also hire a tutor. A number of textbook companies have sold their answer books to Chegg, which is entertaining. I learned at least this week from an excellent article by Michael Feldstein that apparently Chegg has bought the answer books to various textbooks and then offers them for a price to students online. So basically what we have now is a place where all of these people can get together, and they have really kind of a nasty business model. So their business model is, and actually Course Hero's business model, I'll give you, is another one of the nasty cousins that Brian just referred to. What they do is, as you give away your professor's slide decks or whatever, as you post them, you get points. And with those points, you can get tutors who help you to answer your questions. So it becomes this cycle, right? Where students go in, they get help from Chegg. Sometimes they just get an answer. I know some faculty members who literally wait on Chegg to see their exams get posted and then pounce on the IP and try to find out who it was who posted it while the exam is actually happening, right? You have this whole other piece where we have contract cheating, which is a more sort of boutique solution where you can go and find somebody who will write you a paper and not only write it for you, but will guarantee that it will go past Turnitin, will guarantee that it'll pass the plagiarism checkers. So, I mean, this is ubiquitous at this point, particularly with our ability to, our loss of that cone of scarcity, that scarcity where we were able to force students to stay inside the classroom and not touch anything else because we could watch them inside of a classroom. When we lost that, this became ubiquitous. It is now permanently part of the process that we live in inside of education. Any question you can ask, anything that is ever been published, a student can reach out, Google search, find the answer to it, right? So 3 quotes from my students. I have a number of co-op students who've been working with me since the start of the pandemic. If you ask me a question, the answers are literally right there, if it's a published question. So basically, if you take a question, an assignment, if you gave it last year, it was published in a textbook or any of that, you're basically taking a cold beer, putting it on a student's desk and saying, don't drink that beer every day, right? It's not, oh, they're cheating and they're taking this giant liberty. It's that it's right up next to them. If I wanted to cheat when I was in college, I had to go out and find somebody. I had to go out and organize. I had figured out if they knew what they were talking about. It's a gigantic enterprise, right? Now it's one click and you got it, right? It's right next to you. Plus, it has, with a faculty response to Chegg, has led to this escalation that's happened where the courses are getting harder and harder, right? Where in order to try to make it so that students can't cheat online, the tests are getting shorter time zone, the questions are getting more complicated, and they're getting more difficult. And, I was asking a faculty member this the other day, if your test is harder this year and your test was fair last year, then what situation have you put your students in? And so we've got this kind of escalating warfare that's happening where people are, you had to work to cheat. That's exactly right, Matthew. You tell them. So the response here is lock it down, right? Let's create these incredible systems that ostensibly stare at you the whole time. And I mean, I ask any of you right now, okay, so I'll give you a quick test right now. How many of you in the last hour have looked away from your screen, pet your dog, talked to a child, looked at a squirrel out the window? Any of those things would make it suspicious inside of some kind of software that was stalking you. I'll use the word, right? So if you're looking at a proctored solution, right, any of those looks away from what you're doing made you suspicious, right? Anytime you look down, anytime you check your phone because you legitimately just got a text from somebody, any of those things makes you suspicious. And the examples that Bonnie used earlier, I mean, these are crazy kinds of situations, extreme situations where people are forcing themselves to sit, squirrel, where? Exactly, right? And now we're dealing in suspicion levels with our students. Why would we want to live like this? Is this the education system that we're looking for? Like at some point, yeah, the Proctor system would have flagged me down so many times. No kidding. Every time I look around, every time you twist, every time you do anything, I'm looking outside. It's nice and sunny outside. The sun's on the birds. I failed my class, right? It neither works nor are we going to win, right? So if you look at the research, it doesn't help, whatever else. It's not a war we're going to win. And plus, what are we even trying to win, right? What is this thing that we're looking to get out of this? What are we trying to do? We're trying to hold on to a system that we all grew up in, that we all understand. That's about people memorizing content and about pulling that together. And I understand the desire to hold on to it. And I understand our desire to see it as the way the system is. I remember the first time I tried to make my first PowerPoint deck, and I thought I had to do it in a certain way. Frankly, again, thanks to Brian Lamb, he was one of the first people who I saw do something totally different. A presentation with Stephen Downs that he did that was totally different. It broke me out of my expectations of what I needed to do as a presenter. But the way that we were taught simply doesn't apply to the world that we're in, right? It's not where we are anymore. Okay, so what do we do then? So the system's changed. We can't do the testing the way we did it before. We can't send assignments out the same way we did. So I have 5 things, okay? 5 suggestions for things you can do, things that I've been telling people about, things that I think are helpful. I would love to hear more from you guys in terms of the things that you guys are doing, but sharing from me to you guys, this is what I'm thinking. So the first piece is about building trust. So this is hard on both sides. One of the first things that I have to do with students is convince them that I'm not joking. When I say I really want their opinion, they're like, no, you don't. There's a real answer to your question, and you're just not telling me what it is. And all this like collaborative nonsense that you're telling me is just whatever. There's a real answer. Just tell me what it is. Tell me what I need to do to pass. So that trust needs to be built from the students in, because that student group right now, that audience, does not trust their faculty, right? And at the same time, faculty doesn't trust their students. They're convinced at all points in time that somebody's trying to get it over on them. So I think that building of that trust is absolutely critical. So with this abundance, we need to slowly go through this process where the things that we do allow us to build trust back and forth. And the first step in that trust is self-awareness on our part, right? Is to look at our practices and ask ourselves, what do I really want the students to do? A great story from one faculty member in the midst of all of this in March of last year. He stops the conversation that the group we're in, we had about 20 of us, and he says, oh my God, I've been covering content for 15 years in this class. I've always known that my students couldn't possibly get all of what I was telling them. And for some reason, I figured I needed to cover all this content, engineering prof. And he goes, if I just did one project and we worked really hard on that project, they'd learn way more. Why am I even doing this? Right? And I think that is really the first step in this, is that self-awareness, that reflection on what we actually think student success looks like. Is the fact that a student could remember a fact on a given day, which they will probably forget the next day, what we want as an outcome from our class? Is that what we think that success looks like in our professions and our fields and in the things that we care about? Or is it something deeper? So I think that self-awareness, that self-reflection is the very first piece. And the other one, and I really can't say this enough, is that we need to establish a really clear social contract. If you're going to change the way that you teach, you need to be really clear with students about what that change is. And you need to make it so that they have a chance to engage themselves in understanding what that is. So you guys can create a social contract between you. They can get a chance to understand it, and you can work it through. It takes a while. That first 4 to 6 classes can be a struggle sometimes, depending on other faculty, depending on where those students are, depending on what's going on. But that establishment of the social contract is super critical to that trust piece. So the second part is about what we assess, right? So if we're assessing facts and retention of facts, gonna get ourselves into trouble. The way that I like to look at it is the distinction between a well-structured problem and an ill-structured problem. A well-structured problem is a problem where we know what the question is, we know what all the inputs are, and we know what the right answer is. So as a faculty member, I know what the right answer is. Well, most problems in life aren't really like that in any field that you're in, right? So anytime you end up in a situation where you're assessing a well-structured problem, I'm not saying you don't cover them. I'm not saying you don't discuss the multiplication table. I'm not saying that there aren't facts that we have that people need to know. It doesn't mean you have to assess them. Do people need to know certain kinds of things in certain fields? Yep. Do they need to be able to remember each individual fact at any given time? No. And the truth is, the secret truth is, that a lot of people actually give tests to get students to study so that they will read the material, right? Just so that they'll engage with the material. You build the trust first, you assess student growth, they're going to read that material anyway. They're still going to, the fact that you gave a test on that material is not going to change the fact that they read it or remembered it, right? If it's only something you're doing as a threat, if you're beating students with the assessment stick, it's not going to work. It's certainly not going to work anymore. So I try to use ill-structured problems. So things that are not directly measurable, don't have clear solutions, and you can only ever work on part of the problem. Real life solutions. Best article I ever read on it is the original Wicked Problems article from 1973. Riddle and Weber's article is so good. And it really kind of lays out how no matter what you're doing, real life doesn't really have well-structured problems. And we're not preparing people for real life by giving them well-structured problems, because life is full of these ill-defined problems that don't have clear answers. And that struggle with uncertainty is what makes so many people so good at the things that they care about, right? So iterative assignments, formative feedback, that one project that engineering prof was doing, one project in the term, keep rolling through, those assignments keep coming back upon themselves. And the as feedback you're giving is formative. Here's how you can do that better. Here's how this can get better, right? That, again, it creates trust, but it also is such good learning. Back to the wicked problems. So this is another piece. Our time is so structured by the education system we inherited, right? We teach 3 hours a week. There's some expectation, if you believe in the way the university was originally structured, not originally, but the 20th century version of the university, that a student studies for 2 or 3 hours outside of class for every hour they're inside of class. If you look at a community college, usually those are mushed together and you end up with a 35 or 40-hour week. That time and the way we thought of that time was so much about the fact that we had to collect people together to give them information. Now that we don't need to pile people into a room so we can hand information to them from my mouth to their ears, we can rethink how we build out that time, right? So the first rethinking is that first 5 minutes of class. How do you set out the context? And if you're going to change the method that you're going to do, you have to continuously go back to that social contract and restate what it is that you're looking for. I think of a medical prof, I used to work in a medical school, a medical prof who used to get so upset with students who would come to the hospital without being dressed properly. And I asked that prof, I was like, well, what did your parents do? And she goes, well, both of my parents were doctors. Okay, so where do you think you learned what the social contract was for being a doctor? Oh, I guess I learned that from my parents. I'm like, right. And we're trying to widen the participation inside the med school here. Where do you think that kid that you're upset with learned how? Right? We need to continuously, if we're going to change a thing, we need to continuously be fair and upfront with those students and tell them what that change looks like. This is one, this is my insanely scientific Twitter poll 538 votes, which is a lot for a Twitter poll for me. I grant you it's not a scientific poll given the people who follow me on Twitter, but shorter bursts. I mean, providing 7 minutes of context on an issue, fantastic. Doing a 2-hour lecture, I'm not saying there aren't beautiful 2-hour lectures out there. I'm not even saying there isn't a context where once or twice a term you might want to give one. But realistically, what we're here to do is provide context, right? We don't have to deliver the information anymore. Simply don't need to do it. Oops, that's the wrong way. So those credit hours, that's 3 hours of me talking to you, and then the 9 hours of that person, or 6 hours of that person working on their own, let's say a 10-hour week. To me, one of those things we can really do going forward is think about that 10 hours from scratch and not worry about how much time is a lecture and how much time we're together, but ask ourselves what we're trying to get done. What's the most effective use of that time? What's the best way for us to use it? I have one professor I was talking to the other day who's almost all doing interviews now, one-on-one contact, a 4th-year course. And she's like, you know what? It's way more valuable for me to sit down with each individual student over the course of the term and have them work mostly on their own, because at that point, I'm getting, given their particular field, I'm getting right in with what that student needs, right, at the right time. Now, I'm not saying that's a solution for everybody. What I'm saying is that we are not tied to that delivery of content anymore in the same way. All right, 2 more. Teach meaning. And this sort of comes together with all the other stuff I'm saying, is that the value that we provide in a classroom is just not the content anymore, right? The fact that I can remember a thing does not make me valuable anymore. It might make me a good trivia player, but even trivia is getting really, really hard to play now, right? It's the mistakes that we've made. It's the things that we've learned, right? That are the real value that we're bringing to the classroom. So the more that's what we're bringing, the more context we're doing, the more conceptualizing we're doing in the classroom, and the more we make those facts or those things or those well-structured problems just the language of the classroom, right? Just the thing that we exchange back and forth, right? The community of conversation starts to become the curriculum. You start to take up the knowing inside of it, right? Just by being there. If people are engaged and active, they're going to learn those things that you would have put on a multiple choice test anyway, right? But bring your experience to the classroom. I was talking to another faculty member at another institution the other day, and they were like, those are the 4 boring weeks of the course. Really? 4 whole weeks that you're bored by? And she's like, no, I'm not bored by it. Students are always bored. I'm like, okay, well, this is your actual field. She's like, yeah, no, it's actually my field. It's really boring. Like, does it have to be? Like, and we started talking about it. Turns out she's really excited about it, but she'd never actually shared her personal context in the classroom. That's what students are there for, right? They need to hear from us. They need to hear about the ways in which we've learned the thing, the mistakes that we've made to get there, right? And lastly, and I think this is probably the most important message, is just the care, right? It's got to be something we put into all the work that we do. It is, if we care about students, then we're going to build that trust. If we care about students, we're going to share our experiences. If we care about students, we're going to be wanting to give them that formative feedback and help them get better. If you look at learning through the lens of caring, right, about those students and where they're going, it changes the model. And then all the I'm supposed to's and I'm have to's and all of the false, the rigidity that we have, all those things we think we're supposed to do can fall away when we look at it from the perspective of caring about the students who are in front of us, right? What does that mean in practice? Bonnie and I have been saying this since the start of the pandemic. Keep your courses simple, keep them equitable, keep them engaging. Not simple as in stupid, but simple as in clear for what you're trying to get done, right? Equitable in all the ways that Bonnie was talking about it today, understanding that our world is a complex place and not everybody comes to our classroom with the same advantages or the same situation. You know, everybody comes in a different way. And for God's sakes, be engaging, right? That whole, like, those are the 4 boring weeks of my class. You just can't. right? There's too much going on in people's lives. The world is too complex now. And frankly, the students have too many other things coming at them for us to just give in to our classes being boring. I'm not saying we can't expect hard work from people. More than happy to have students work hard, but hard work can still be engaging. And that's where that every student, not all students, right? So when you think of not caring for my students, but caring for that student and that student, I understand that can be challenging at larger class sizes, and there are all kinds of sort of caveats you can put on top of this. But at the end of the day, if that's our first thought, right, we're going to get through our classes a lot better. Am I suggesting that there are going to be a couple of students who are going to sneak through by cheating because you're going to give them the benefit of the doubt? Yep. And I'm saying I don't care. I'm saying that I would rather have faculty focus on the people, the students in front of them, care about those students, and have a couple of people cheat than catch every single cheater and end up in this weird competitive battle that we are with students right now. It's not healthy for anybody as it stands now, right? In that particular, I'm not suggesting some of you don't have fantastic courses, but this sort of competitive piece that's happening is not a healthy situation, right? I would rather have a couple people slip through and have us focus on those students and about where they are, right? So we design for care. It is designing for trust. That trust gets built when we care for our students. They can feel it. And last, and this is probably the most important message, take care of yourselves out there. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot of changes we're making. There's a lot of pressures on everybody. I wish you all the best. We're going to transition into Q&A. So if you guys have questions or comments or things you would like to disagree with, we're more than happy to take those on now. And I appreciate your patience.
That was an amazing chat. It was really fun. Dave has 2 screens, but I only have 1, so I wasn't able to see the chat when I was presenting, but I really enjoyed spending time in that robust conversation.
That was lovely. Thank you so much, both of you, Dave and Bonnie. Sherry and I are here to help moderate the comments so you don't have to read the questions out to yourself. And as soon as they start coming up in the chat, we will start bringing them forward to you.
Oh.
Sorry that there's a 40-second delay.
It was faster by the end. Like at the very beginning when I tested it, it was 40 seconds, but I was testing it after and it's more like 15. Like it's actually not too bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love that there's so much chat going on because it really talks about putting into practice what you were talking about engaging people in learning.
Speaks to the engaged educators at TRU also.
Okay, so Brian Lamb has just put a question here that says, I'm curious if Bonnie and or Dave might share one concrete thing that they've done at Windsor that they felt has moved the needle.
No pressure. Go ahead, Dave.
Thank you. Is it Lamb? Brian Lamb? Sorry, thank you for your question. I appreciate it. I appreciate the softball question. Yeah, I think there is. I think the thing that has been, if there's anything that I have managed to do in the last year that I'm happy about, is I haven't taught any technology. When we took on teaching for the pandemic, when we put 250 faculty through the course that we designed. We didn't tell anybody how to press any buttons. We didn't tell anybody how to click anything. We didn't tell anybody about any of that stuff. We talked about abundance. We talked about complexity. We talked about how the internet was important. We talked about caring for students. And that's all we did. And I really feel like it changed some of the discussions, that we were having about what the internet meant to education. It was no longer, can you just tell me how to get that thing on the internet? It was, oh, I see. And it really changed the tone of some of that discourse. So that would be the one thing that I would point to.
And I'm going to leap in and take a similar, but also kind of in a sense, the opposite position. I teach a lot of technology courses in our Faculty of Ed. And the first year that I was doing it, I became aware that the students really felt like they were going in to come out with this tool parade of options, right? They wanted to feel like they were getting a sense of what tools were out there for them to teach with in K-12. I don't really like teaching tools because I've been doing this for long enough to know that by the time that the course wraps, that tool may no longer be available, may no longer be open, may no longer be free. And that if I'm just teaching the tools, then I'm not teaching some of the critical concepts that we talked about today. So I started something about 2 years ago from a tiny little grant that I've worked with students since, and it's something called the Open Page, and it's a tool parade, but it's a tool parade of student-led projects researching specific digital tools from a teacher's point of view. So not what the vendor would say about here is the shiny stuff that this tool can do for you, but rather how can I use this tool in a classroom? What are the data implications of this tool? Because that's really important for me to have both K-12 teachers and faculty colleagues thinking about, like what are these tools doing with student data, and what can this tool do to differentiate learning and really engage different students with different needs. And so we've got a series of little like 4 or 5 minute videos and also about 15-minute podcasts about 25 different tools. I'm going to throw this into, I'm not in the YouTube window anymore, so I'm just going to throw this in for Christine or Sherry to share, and you are welcome to take a look at that. But that is something that I'm proud of because it's been work with students thinking about tools from a human perspective, but encapsulating them in ways that may be accessible to you folks too.
All right, and then it sounds like Dave would like to take Lauren's question next. So as a K-12 educator, math and science, there's a myth that we need to rigorously test to get kids ready for university. What's your take on how to best prep kids to transition to higher learning?
So one of those myriad of jobs I referred to before, I used to be responsible for first-year advisement and new student orientation at a university for a few years. A question close to my heart. I don't think that it's entirely a myth. I think that learning how to take tests is something that will not hurt them in the short term, but I would treat it as a game and not as learning. I would totally separate it off from my class, and I would say, okay, so this is how you work your way through a multiple choice test, and I would game it because it's not learning. The biggest single problem for students coming into universities that I ever saw in the work that I did was they do not know how to make a decision for themselves. The 1,000 students that I watched come into the first year advisement office and go, I need to go to university. But no practice, no habits of mind, none of those things that they needed to be able to help decide what they wanted to do, and therefore they struggled. So does testing happen in university? Sure it does, but treat it like a game, teach them the skills for passing tests, but that's not what the learning process is. Right? That's not where they're successful. The students who are successful in university are not the ones who just do good tests. They're the ones who engage with the material. They're the ones who end up being more successful as time goes on.
All right, we have a question from Management 1000 Videos is the title. Any tips, ideas on how to scale ideas like give ill-structured problems to a larger class, how to develop new non-checkable problems each time through the course?
Bonnie, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to keep going?
I'll do a quick thing with it. I teach about 170, 180 students a year, and so doing long, in-depth personal feedback for everything is exhausting, and I've had to scale back on some of that as I've been teaching larger classes and more students at one time. What I am finding is that if I am careful about the way that I structure some of the peer learning, that I can still get people working with ill-structured problems or messy problems or wicked problems. The nice thing about those is there isn't a right answer. And so structuring something where people are actually trying to put in one good idea and then give, again, my students need to practice formative feedback because they're going to be teachers. So giving formative feedback on somebody's idea that is working okay. If I need them to come out with a particular right answer, that's not so good, but that's not how an ill-structured problem works anyway. So that's how I'm doing that at scale to an extent.
I guess the first answer is it's really hard for me. It is obviously going to be an awful lot easier to present people with real personal problems if you have enough people to be able to interact with them individually. If you are a faculty member with one graduate assistant grading 400 people, it's obviously going to be really difficult to get engaged in all those processes. One of the things that we've been talking about here is Peerwise is one of the ways that we've been talking about. It's just one example. I'm actually putting together a whole piece on this right now, which I'm happy to send along later. But Peerwise is one of those tools that allows you to go in and have students create questions for each other, right? So there's this whole gaming process where they have to ask questions, figure stuff out. It's still reasonably well structured, frankly, but the process itself is reasonably ill structured at least. It's tough. It's hard. There's no doubt about it.
And it's particularly hard when students may come in, and different disciplines work differently this way, but in some disciplines, students have been taught all the way through that they're there to take tests. And so they come in expecting to get the right answer, and that's their own idea of success. So there's actually, in any of the kinds of teaching that we're talking about, there's a lot of unlearning. And there's a lot of unlearning for the students, and sometimes there's pushback from the students. And we do have to be fair to the students in terms of making that explicit, right? I talk a lot about the things that we are, in a sense, not doing, and what I'm asking for from them. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. And so I just want to skip back. There was a question that was asked above a little earlier. I think you've actually spoken to it a couple times, but just a chance to get in any last pieces of advice on that. So it's from Verena Roberts, and it says, can you give us some suggestions on designing for assessment options other than RISE that support participatory practices in asynchronous courses like our open learning courses?
For me, the RISE is just a pure feedback piece rather than my own assessment piece. But what I've tried to do, and it is not necessarily the answer or the right answer, but in working with digital tools is rather than getting my students to show that they can talk about something, I'm getting them to make things and try things and go through processes that may even be about showing their mistakes in doing that. I get them to do, choice boards about lesson type ideas so that they're showing a sampling of their thinking and producing stuff. And then they do engage with each other's stuff, but it's mostly about what can they do with digital tools, even if it's partway or not perfect, and trying to encourage them that most of us who are working with these digital tools are also doing so imperfectly, and so that process is okay, right? You don't have to have something 100% to use it with your students, and so that's been big in my practice and my teaching.
And I'll take the other side of that entirely. So one of the things that I do is I use learning contracts. And so the students go in and choose all my assignments in that particular course that I designed. All the assignments are pass fail. Students pick which ones they want to do. They pick what their final grade's going to be. And then through the term, I assess pass or fail on all the assignments. It totally changes the way that students work. It allows them some choice in terms of being able to focus on the stuff they're doing. The argument there is that students always pick what their final grade is going to be anyway. A student goes in knowing they're going to get a B. And what I'm saying is I want all of your work to be as hard as you can, but choose the amount that you're actually going to do given your life and the way that things work out for you. And then I will fail your assignment, but I'll fail it like 4 times and give you a chance to keep rewriting it until you get there, right? And it just changes the relationship that I have with students. I'm no longer judge and juror over their opinions, particularly when people are like sharing their own. My personal bugaboo through this whole transition is people who are asking for students' personal experience about something or ask them about their opinion and then grading them badly because they had bad opinions. Like, makes me crazy, right? That kills your engagement because suddenly there is a secret message and I've asked you for something, but really there's a secret message that I want.
It kills your trust.
Totally kills the trust.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing, no matter what you're doing with assessment, try to put yourself in a position where you're not the police, where you're encouraging people to contribute genuinely to the extent that they can, to the using the skills that you're teaching them, whatever those are, but where you're not just kind of arbitrarily the judge and jury and the police, because that lines up with the ways in which a lot of the tools that we're using are encouraging our pedagogy, right? We've got to recognize that a lot of the tools that we're using, I don't know if you saw the article last year, or some, Brenna, maybe you can throw it into the chat, but Against Cop Shit, great article, basically about how many digital tools are leading us in directions that encourage that type of pedagogy, and figuring out our own ways to push back against that is important.
All right, and thank you so much. And it kills me to say we're actually almost out of time and we still have questions coming up in the comments. But thank you so much, Dave and Bonnie. That was so helpful and so wonderful. And I can see there will be thank you messages coming in the chat here soon. And I invite you guys to enjoy the rest of the day if you so choose, and check out some of the sessions from our faculty here. Sherry, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, I appreciate that you're here and with us, and very interesting, timely topics.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much for having us.
Thank
Cheers,
you.
everybody.
Have a great day, folks.
Have a great day. Take care, everybody.
And for our TPC participants, just for your next steps, we'll be having a short break as per the schedule from 10:30 to 10:50. If you feel like socializing, there are socializing rooms, room 1 through 4, built into our schedule. And if you feel like being by yourself and getting coffee and having a little washroom break, that's good too. And the next sessions are going to start at 10:50 sharp. So be sure to use your schedule to access those, their big blue button rooms, and you just click on the link in your schedule. And enjoy the rest of the day. Please join us back at lunch. We'll be doing 2 more draws for door prizes in lunchroom number 1 at 12:30. And if you're having any technical difficulties, there's instructions at the top of the schedule in yellow for who to contact. We hope you have a lovely, lovely day, and we'll see you back for lunch.